Starting all the way back in 1979 with a claustrophobic horror film, the Alien franchise began and has been going strong ever since, with 9 films ranging in variety from full-blown action, philosophical drama, and now with the first TV show in the franchise, we now have an Ice Age sequel. Alien Earth sees the xenomorphs and the dumb characters that accompany them move to the small screen and also move to Earth for the first time in this franchise, well, factoring in that these aren't canon. With the final episode dropping, I've decided not just to rank the Alien films, but to also chuck in this new TV show and rank it alongside those films, something which I'm looking to do a bit more in my rankings. So with 10 projects to talk about, let's not waste any more time, and let's just jump straight into my ranking of the Alien franchise. Individually, the Alien and Predator franchises respectively have thrived when going down the horror route as opposed to action. However, when you get a film titled Alien vs Predator, you don't mind if they push that to the side and focus on the action and put the focus on these two IPs battling out against each other. However, Requiem goes down the route of trying to implement a grittier tone, and from that, just way too slow and just not an enjoyable watch at all. Any attempts at crafting a tense scenario just doesn't work because the lighting is abysmal. You know, obviously they're going for a darker tone, but I didn't think they meant that literally because visibility is at an all-time low. It's hard to make out what's going on in a scene, and it doesn't feel satisfying when there's any sort of big moments. And the only time this film has any sort of lighting for it in the daytime is when it's fleshing out its unbearable characters. You'd hope in a film like this, yes, it's always good to have some development for characters or some kind of way to distinguish one from another, but in this scenario, you kind of want that development to come along naturally whilst focusing on the two titular creatures. There's just no momentum built as there's so much time spent establishing these unlikable characters. So yeah, for a film which is supposed to be a big fun event, there's just nothing to enjoy really. All the action is hidden in shadows, the characters are unbearable, and just the overall tone is a bit too gruesome and gritty to have a fun time with. The mainline series was already on a rough trajectory, and Alien Resurrection proved to be the worst of that mainline series. Messiness just plagues this film from start to finish with an abundance of aspects which just don't work and don't merge well together. Jean-Pierre Jeunet has a fast-paced, quirky style which has been implemented in a lot of his films before. However, it doesn't really translate well into a film like this where it's supposed to be tense and horror focused. Obviously, it's nice to have a film which is a bit more unique if there are a lot of entries in a franchise. However, this one just went too far away from the formula in its tone, and it just felt extremely awkward. Chuck in over-sexualization of characters and just an overly explicit script, then it just didn't work at all for me. But Alien 3 had given Ripley a fairly satisfying conclusion. Alien Resurrection does what it says in the title and brings her back, however does that in such a strange way and doesn't really justify its choice, putting the character through uncomfortable and unfamiliar scenarios which ultimately just don't prove to be an enjoyable experience. So yeah, this just felt like an unnecessary film from the over-sexualized content, a director's style which doesn't merge well with this franchise, and of course just bringing back Sigourney Weaver in quite a disgraceful way. It's hard to believe that this is a David Fincher film given the great films he's made since, but I guess it was a learning curve for him because this film was very disappointing. Right from the start, it commits the absolute sequel sin, which is undoing the victory of that previous one, and the way that this film does it as well would leave fans outraged. That more or less set the tone for this film, with the rest of it also being quite underwhelming. There are some strong ideas in here, but the way they're executed just don't excite. There is a lot of coverage that this film had a lot of interference from the studio, and I think that is quite obvious in the end, as the tone and story are just all over the place. This franchise has been praised for its practical effects, especially with the titular aliens. However, in this case, this was that era where they were trying to transition more from practical to special effects, and in the middle of that transition you just get this film which has some very outdated CGI which just takes you out of any sort of tense environment. Alien 3 is just an absolute mess of a film, and it's lucky that they've managed to make films which are far worse, because this in itself is just not a good film and a major step down from the previous 2 films that they had released. The term guilty pleasure is thrown around a lot, which is something which you're aware isn't good or isn't something that you should like, but you can't help but enjoy it. And I kind of feel that way about Alien vs Predator. Yes, it has clearly got its flaws, but I think there's a charm and cheesiness about it where it kind of works, you know, far better than what Requiem does. The premise is simple, you know, the title could literally be the synopsis. And I think that this film somewhat delivers on that promise, from constant action with little story squashed in between. The environment is certainly interesting and does make it stand out, however that can become quite repetitive. Alongside that, you do have a lot of human characters who take up the screen time, which is kind of necessary in a film like this, but is always going to be the weak part. There are plenty of hilariously bad moments, especially with the script, but in terms of what this film delivers, I feel like it does enough to be this high on the list. You know, very campy, very over the top, but at the end of the day, you just wanted to see aliens fight predators. Prometheus is a very interesting one because I really enjoyed this when I first watched it. On rewatch, that enjoyment kind of fizzled out a bit more. Certainly one of the more unique projects in this franchise, and interestingly, most franchises don't get a prequel of this vein. You know, it essentially shows you the origins of the xenomorphs and plenty of other components which factor into the wider franchise, and with that it just doesn't really feel much like an Alien film at all. You do have some components, we've seen it before in this franchise, but others are entirely new, and it works sometimes, but other times it just feels way too drawn out and unnecessary, making for quite a dull experience, I'll say. I think it's important to know what you want from this film before going into watching it. If you're expecting, you know, an Alien film like you've had before, you're going to find it extremely dull. However, if you're going into it, you're wanting to see answers or even new questions that appear, then you'll get some enjoyment out of it. I don't really know what to think going into it, and I certainly got both sides of the argument. I found the questions raised quite interesting, but then the result of them fairly boring, far too detached from what has come before, which I guess is technically after this film's events. There are some great concepts, however the execution is quite generic and forgettable. I appreciated steering back towards a much edgier tone, however the narrative flow is helped out massively by the most stupid characters you'll see. So that just adds an extra layer of frustration. Very hot and cold in plenty of areas, and one which is probably the most divisive of this franchise. Take me home. Alien Covenant is pretty much the sequel to the prequel, carries on that story from Prometheus, and to be honest, it's kind of more of the same. There are a few things which are improved upon. There's obviously a greater shift back towards this franchise's roots, which generates some tense horror action whilst also carrying on that story from Prometheus. But yet again, this film's plot is so lazily written in areas where it relies so much on these characters' dumb decisions. It's decisions which a normal person would not make in order to progress the narrative, and it just makes it really frustrating because there's a lot of strong components to this film. You know, visually it's stunning, that the location does help a lot, but the way they've captured that and incorporated it into the story was a big highlight, as was the alien action. But yet again, there is a lot of moments where it just feels unnecessary within this franchise. However, it is acting as the bridge between Prometheus and the rest of the Alien franchise, and when it does tap into the latter, it is much stronger. However, it has the same negatives as its predecessor. So nestling in just outside of the top 3 is the main talking point today, Alien. Now with this series being the first in this franchise, there was a bit of pressure onto it, and often when you have a series emerge within a big film franchise. They feel quite unnecessary, but rather than just following the typical Alien formula, Alien Earth has some ambitious ideas. Now that's not to say there aren't those Alien characteristics, but I think this series does merge what fans would want from an Alien series as well as trying to do something quite new. You know, we genuinely have some of the finest horror moments within this franchise in this series, so it's safe to say that they've once again recaptured that horror tone that was so popular early on and utilized it in such a gruesome way, especially when there's plenty of slower moments. It was nice to have these ones to kind of get the heartbeat racing again. Now, as for its ambitious ideas, they were interesting and obviously quite different to what we've had before. They didn't always work. Sometimes they messed around with the pacing of this series, and other times it took over way too much where it was easy to kind of lose interest or be detached from the story. I think the actors did a solid job, especially those who weren't exactly portraying humans. You know, we had some androids, or we had actors portraying children in adult android bodies. So, you know, we had a bit of a mix and it wasn't just a straightforward human that they got to play, but I think they did a solid job. Where the criticism comes from the characters is down to the writing and the direction it takes them. But yeah, while there is a nice balance of sci-fi and horror, I do think this series fails to reach its potential, as there's just a bit of messiness with the story, whether that's through structure or just how much time is devoted to certain parts. I felt like there was a lot of unnecessary slow moments, and that came back to bite them because I felt as though the finale was quite unsatisfying and felt more like a penultimate episode, which lacked the payoff you wanted from all the build-up. Now obviously, if there is a second season, you'll probably get that payoff, but as for now, it was a bit disappointing. But overall, I found it quite solid, and yeah, a decent debut for the Alien franchise on the small screen. With the latest film to be released, Alien Romulus secures the 3rd spot with no real competition around it, as let's be honest, everybody knows the top 2 going into every Alien ranking. The question is, which way around are they? Alien Romulus goes back to the basics and really dives into the horror that made this franchise so successful from the get-go, and then obviously draws in some action which is equally as satisfying. Whilst the general premise is very similar to the original, Fede Alvarez's flair and style separates it from those ones and just delivers a strong entry. Horror always struggles to create captivating characters, especially when it's stuck to just one film rather than a franchise. However, I really appreciated the characters from this film, and in particular David Johnson as an android. Yes, an android who they made us really care about. They siphoned a lot of the emotion through him, and I think the way Johnson performed and the way he was written was spot on. He acts as the sort of anchor for the emotion which drives Rain, and also given his intelligent nature, it doesn't hurt to have him explain scenarios and help the plot move forward in that sense. Those two characters had this wholesome relationship at the center of it all, which added an extra personal touch to the Alien franchise, which hasn't always been the case. So from that, you're very invested in what happens to them. Now, I know this film has been out for over a year, but there is a moment which feels immoral and can be quite distasteful to some. I understand why they did it, but the manner that they did it in felt, as I said, distasteful. So that did put a little bit of a dampener on it, but I don't think it takes away all the great work that was done on this film, and the way they managed to capture that claustrophobic environment and tension on levels which I haven't seen from this franchise since, well, you'll see in my top 2. It is the original that's runner-up in this case. Alien just thrives through its absolutely claustrophobic environment, which I've mentioned before, but here it is perfected, with obviously space being a big factor into this. That environment where you're literally stuck in this spaceship, there's nowhere to run, or as the motto was, no one can hear you scream. It really makes you feel like these characters have no hope against these animalistic creatures. The film also takes its time in building up that tension. You know, the iconic chestburster scene comes to mind. After that, it really kicks in, with things slowly going wrong as the film progresses, and through that raises the tension and even your heart rate. Alongside this, the characters are just as fascinating, as everyone serves a purpose, whether that means they're to be sacrificed or some important plot beats. It was nice having them all around, and even when they would do things which seem quite odd or out of place, it comes back into play later and serves a purpose and leads to some of the most shocking moments as well. Like with many films in a similar vein, Alien wisely decides to not show too much of its foe, so you don't actually really know to the full extent what they're fighting until the very end, and when it does, it's very satisfying and makes it hard to take your eyes off of. And alongside that, the practical effects just can't be beaten, you know. It just adds an extra layer of realism and magic to it that you just can't get with CGI. There's no wonder this film is iconic. It is an absolute staple for horror and how to execute tension, as well as showing how creepy outer space can be. And while Alien is superb and an absolute classic, for me, Aliens was the clear winner to top this list. And it's not to say it's Alien versus Aliens, it should be Alien and Aliens, because this film works so well because of what came before. There's a slight genre shift, with the focus more being on action whilst also still containing those immensely tense moments and just the fear that came with that film as well. It's such a strong blend of superb action and terrifying horror as well. I praise the characters from that first film, but here they're even more memorable and you feel more attached to them this time around. And as the title suggests, there isn't just one alien, there is several. And with that, you get to see a bunch more of them, which I think works better in this sort of environment where it's more action focused. Whereas before, if you kept them out of sight, it just kind of increased those tension levels. From seeing more of them, you get to see the incredible practical effects which went into the xenomorphs, showing off more of their disgusting appearance and characteristics. This is the perfect action horror film with satisfying elements in both of those fields, as well as an engaging story which keeps you gripped from minute one to the last. So that is my ranking of all of the Alien films, and of course Alien Earth, the newly released TV show. Please let me know what you think of it down below, and also while you're there, if you could like and subscribe and also comment your ranking, I'd be really interested to see. I'm doing more content on YouTube Shorts and TikTok now as well, so if you could, I'd appreciate if you could follow there and keep an eye on that stuff. I'll be trying to implement shorter versions of my rankings as well as reviews. Yes, thank you so much for watching. I have some more reviews up here, so hopefully you can find something else for you there.